Hey guys! So today you and I are going to talk about transcending programming languages and getting to a level of programming mastery where languages almost don't matter anymore. So let's get into it. Now, for the juniors out there, let's define some things first and foremost. When you start out, you should absolutely take good care to make sure that the first language that you pick is going to give you the things that you want to be able to build. Because when you first start out, the first language that you pick is going to set the tone for things going forward. I will actually argue that there are some languages that are so far out there that it's actually a little bit dangerous for a complete beginner to start there. That's at least my opinion. So if you want an extreme example, Haskell would be a very bad first choice for a programmer, I think, because the difference between Haskell and almost every other programming language is very big, which means that adopting the next language and learning the ideas of the next language can be a little bit tricky. And even though it's not very sexy, learning something like Java, for example, might be a very good first choice, or Python, or stuff of that nature, because these languages are a lot of the ideas, pretty much all of the ideas that are in all the other languages, you can find in these types of languages. Now, when you start out, syntax and just the concepts of how to use a programming language is it's a little bit tricky to first get it, and then you will get to a point where you understand the concept, you understand syntax, you understand the different structures. And when I mean the different structures, I'm talking about variables, loops, conditions, all of these different switches, objects, you name it, like all the things that you would find normally in a programming language. Now, when you get to a point, and you will get to a point where you feel that, hey, I'm starting to understand this, and for some reason you're going to get exposure to another programming language. And this is where the key thing I was saying earlier comes in. If you have picked a language that is fairly similar to other languages, you will start to see a pattern. Oh, you see that, wow, okay, so variables are all in all the languages. You see that the way that you write maybe a switch statement is fairly similar, and you see the loops, yeah, they're pretty similar, the different types that we have in the different languages. And what happens there is that you now have a red thread that connects the first thing that you learned, the first language that you learned, and you can take that red thread and follow it through into the next language and start adopting the syntax of that language. And you may think that it stops there, and depending on what type of programmer you are and your level of interest, it might stop there. But I'm going to say that it's fairly certain that it won't. The next language after that is going to have a even better or bigger red thread, because as you acquire more and more experience and you see more and more languages, and you start to understand the pattern of the language structure and the way that you do things in these languages, the easier it will be for you to adopt the next language, and then the next language, and the next language, and next language, and so forth and so forth. Some people even will argue that there are languages that are so similar that if you know one language, you know the other. And I want to just touch on that, because I think there's a half-truth there. And I will also touch on why I think that it's only half true, and what the true challenge of a senior or someone with a lot of experience programming, what the challenges are going forward. Now, half-truth. Let's take my favorite example, C# and Java. Now, these two languages are extremely, extremely similar. And in theory, if you know the Java syntax, you can pick up the C# syntax in a very short amount of time. And I think that's true for Python and Ruby, for example, also. Very, very true. And why am I calling this a half-truth? I argue that it's a half-truth, because when you get to a certain level of experience, if you know Java and you want to go into C#, learning the syntax will, yes, absolutely take you maybe, let's do a high count. Let's say that the syntax takes you a week of full-time practicing, and I'm talking work level practicing. I'm talking about 8 hours, that sort of thing. That's a very high count, because that's how similar these things are. Now I'll ask you this philosophical question. Are you ready now to start being productive in C#? If your answer is yes, I want to ask you this. When you start learning C#, do you know all of the ways that C# does what it does? .NET frameworks, the databases, all of these other different things around the programming language. Because let's not forget that we have to make a distinction between knowing the syntax of a language and knowing the language. Everybody I know will tell me in this IT world that they know JavaScript. But if I ask them, all right, cool, can you put up an npm package? Can you put up an Express server? Can you access the file system? All of them say no, because they know JavaScript, which usually means that they can write some scripts and put it on a web page and maybe use a little bit of jQuery. Depending on your definition of knowing the language, yeah, sure, you can absolutely claim that you know the language if you just know the syntax. But my experience is that syntax is just a small part of knowing a language. My definition of knowing a language is that you know the syntax, but also the most common things that you will face working in that language. That's where when you truly master a language, when you don't just know the language itself, but all the things that are around the language that is needed in order to basically do the same things that you did in your secure first language, which you know by heart, and you know the tools of that language. That's the way I think about it. So that brings me to the second part of this. What is the greatest challenge then when it comes to adopting new languages? Well, the greatest challenge comes when you realize that learning the syntax it's not difficult. You can learn the syntax of a language very, very quickly, and in just a matter of days or say weeks, be productive and write code. And the more experience you get, the more red threads you have that goes through several languages, the faster it will go. The true challenge is to learn how to think in the correct manner. And what's even worse than that, or rather even more important and the bigger challenge than that, is to actually know all the libraries. Because let's take Java and C#. Just because you know Java's syntax, remember that the names and all the terms and all the jargon and all the libraries and where things are in that ecosystem is very different from what's happening in C#. So the syntax is fairly similar, but everything around it is different. It's actually the biggest challenge when you start at a new job. Let's take my job, for example. I did an absolutely horrible code test for my current position. I had never worked in Scala when I started. And I'm going to admit that that was the single most painful experience in terms of coding test I have ever faced. I was very uncomfortable. Probably because I had to sit and live code in a language I've never written a single line of code in, next to my boss, my future boss. And with his help and a lot of communication and talking, I managed to write the solution that I needed, and I got hired. And I got hired because of this thing I'm going to tell you now. Because my boss has understood from working with me that I have transcended languages. Now that sounds very fancy, but just let me break it down for you. What he's I'm talking about, or rather what he has understood, is that my level of experience with programming, I have had enough red threads through enough languages that he knows that I will pick up this language, the syntax of this language, very, very quickly. And he's right. I could pick up most of the syntax in a matter of days. I think I was productive committing code to the project my first day or second day. Now, I don't know everything about Scala, but I don't have to. I can learn everything as I go along because I know enough programming from other languages that I can immediately understand all of the things that are common between Scala and the other languages. So that's what I call transcending the language. You are so skilled, or rather you have enough experience, that the language syntax doesn't really come into it anymore. You just really need to see it once, and then you can immediately understand what construct it is, how it works, all of that stuff. That's where you're going to get as a junior sooner or later. Trust me, you will get there. And then the true challenge, and this is why it's very important to have be a little bit humble about this. What I'm still trying to learn, which is the case for all of my colleagues, even the new hires, is to learn where everything is. That's the thing that takes the longest time, to learn all the libraries, the names, the mindset, all of that, and that takes time. And that takes time for everyone. And that's the thing that really makes a difference between, as I said, knowing a syntax and knowing a language. Because as I said, you will transcend syntax, but you will not necessarily transcend all this other stuff around it. That's where you should focus your attention and your energy. And that's probably what's going to happen. But I hope you can at least take away this. It feels very nice to get to a point where you can basically work in anything. You may not be the best coder in the world or be the most productive in the new language, but it feels very nice to just be able to jump into something and start seeing the patterns and fall back on your experience and start producing value in something that you've never actually touched before. And yeah, just think about that when you're struggling with this language. It's gonna get better. And remember, knowing all the names and all the libraries and all the jargon and learning the mindset, that's the tricky part. Hopefully you have a great day.